Hi everybody, and welcome to our notes on photosynthesis. Today we're going to go through the two main types of reactions that occur in photosynthesis, the light reactions and the Calvin cycle, and we're going to learn why this is so important. We're going to learn what's used and what's produced in each reaction as well. So photosynthesis, you can think of it as making life from light and air. First thing we're going to talk about are the energy needs of life. We know that life needs energy in order for it to do its life functions. There can be two classifications of life, heterotrophs or animals. These are organisms that get their energy from eating others. So when they eat food, they eat other organisms, so they eat other organic molecules. And they are called consumers. They have to consume their energy. And most of their energy is made from respiration, which we'll do after photosynthesis. Autotrophs are also known as plants because they can make their own energy, or auto means from self, so they're self-producing. So they're called producers. And they convert energy of sunlight into usable things like sugar. And they can build organic molecules from carbon dioxide. And they make energy and synthesize sugars through the process of photosynthesis. So heterotrophs versus autotrophs. And this photosynthesis process makes the organic molecules that heterotrophs consume, and so without photosynthesis we would not have life because there would be no organic molecules to consume. So how are they connected? We haven't spent a lot of time on respiration yet, but this is a general equation for it, where heterotrophs consume glucose. When we eat, our diet has glucose in it, and we use that to produce energy for ourselves, water, and we release carbon dioxide. This is an exergonic process, so when we break down glucose, we're essentially making energy. Autotrophs make energy from light, so in this case, they take in carbon dioxide, water, and light and produce glucose and oxygen from it. And if you look, in this case, we're going from carbon dioxide to glucose, so it's kind of like the opposite process, and so this is an endergonic reaction. So there needs some energy input in order to make this glucose form, which we'll talk about today. ATP is a middle step here in photosynthesis, and we'll learn about that coming up. So in order to be a plant, you have to be able to collect light energy and transform it into chemical energy, or ATP. And then we have to store that light energy if you're a plant, and it has to be a stable form that can move around. And that stable form is usually glucose, but it could be starch or sucrose or something else. They get the building blocks of atoms from the environment, so usually from the soil. And it's a bunch of different atoms: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and magnesium. And they produce all organic molecules needed for growth. Okay, so the carbohydrates, proteins, etc. that they need. So that's what it means to be a plant. Some of the plant structures, we won't get into too much of this, but just so you know, the leaves are responsible for collecting sunlight. Carbon dioxide also goes through the leaves, through the stomats, which are on the leaves, little openings that allow carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. Water gets uptaken from the roots, and nutrients also come from the roots. Just a couple of quick things. If this is the cross-section of the leaf, so this might be the top of the leaf, this might be the bottom of the leaf, these cells here are called guard cells, and they can open and close, and the opening is called the stoma, and that's where carbon dioxide and water can leave and close. So they can open and close, and that's something they can regulate depending on the environment as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about chloroplasts. So you learned in class about the different, or you will learn in class about the different light absorption. So here are the leaves of our, and if we look at a cross-section of a leaf, this is what it looks like. So you can see the guard cells and the stomats here. And then you've got the chloroplasts, kind of like what we saw in the allodia. And now we have our chloroplasts drawing. And within the thylakoids of the chloroplasts, we have chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is going to take in sun energy, and it's going to take in, I'll go back, it's going to reflect green light, and it's going to absorb light of different spectrums, which you will see in our activity in class next time. And then when it takes in carbon dioxide, it can use that to make energy and sugar. So it absorbs sunlight and oxygen and uses it to make energy and sugar. So without chloroplasts, photosynthesis can't happen. Here's some more information about the chloroplasts. We have a double membrane structure, an outer membrane and an inner membrane. The stroma is like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. It's that fluid-filled interior. And then we have these thylakoid, and these are small sacs within the chloroplast that hold the chlorophyll, and this is where the light reactions take place. When you have a stack of thylakoids, and they're all stacked together, that's called a grainum. Graina is plural. And along the thylakoid membrane, if this is our chloroplast, this is our thylakoid, what ends up being produced is a hydrogen ion gradient. So you have a lot of hydrogen inside of the thylakoid. And then there's this thing called ATP synthase. And this pumps hydrogen ions through it, and when that happens, ATP is produced. All right, so photosynthesis. This diagram here will be in your book. You'll see it lots and lots and lots. If you can memorize it, you'll be in good shape. The light reactions are sometimes known as the light-dependent reactions because they need light in order to make it happen. They convert solar energy to chemical energy, which is ATP and NADPH. NADPH is a molecule that will help shuffle along electrons, which helps the process happen. That's all you have to understand about it right now. It's like money in the bank, and when you cash it in, you can make energy. The other set of reactions is called the Calvin cycle. These are independent of light. They are not called the dark reactions because it can be light out when they happen. It doesn't matter. They're the sugar-building reactions, so they use the ATP that's made in the light reactions to make the sugar in the Calvin cycle. Okay. So here's kind of a big thing you need to know about the light reactions. The inputs are sunlight and water, and what's produced is oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. So what happens? First thing that happens is water is split, so you have hydrogen ions and oxygen. The oxygen is released into the environment as a waste product. The hydrogen ions are used to make ATP, and after that, the light that's absorbed by the chlorophyll is going to drive this transfer of electrons to make NADPH. And then, like we saw in that little cartoon a second ago, the hydrogen is going to pump across the thylakoid membrane through that ATP synthase and make ATP. So we got money in the bank. Here's our diagram again. Here's our thylakoid. We've got a couple of them. We have this ATP synthase pump. The hydrogen ions go through it, and we have ATP. And that's going to be used in the Calvin cycle. This is a much more complicated view of the light reactions, which you don't need to know it for this class, but understand that it's a bunch of different systems, and what it does is it utilizes concentration gradients all along the membrane of the thylakoid, and so it shuffles the energy all the way through it in order to produce NADPH and ATP. And here's our ATP synthase, so these hydrogen ions that are coming off of it pump through and make ATP. And then these molecules will move on to the Calvin cycle. Okay, got it. There are a variety of different pigments of photosynthesis that are in the thylakoid membrane. I wanted to spend some time on this, though, because you're going to do an activity in class next time with this. So this is a look at light, and this is the electromagnetic spectrum. So it's all the different types of radiation that moves through the space as a wave, so up and down. It ranges from gamma rays, as you can see, all the way to radio waves, and there's a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum that's visible, known as visible light. And so the visible light goes from purple to red light, and it all has a different wavelength. So this, if you follow my mouse, this is a wave going up and down. The shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy the light has. The longer the wavelength, the lower the energy. And you can see all the colors on this. It's the rainbow. Photosynthesis gets energy by absorbing the wavelengths of light. And so we have chlorophyll A that absorbs best in red and blue. And the accessory pigments are like chlorophyll B and the carotenoids, and these absorb different wavelength colors. And you'll see this in your activity more. And you'll be able to answer the question why plants are green. Okay, so those are the light reactions. The rest of the time we're going to move on to talking about the second set of reactions called the Calvin cycle. Oh, something happened here. Hang on. Okay, so here's our Calvin cycle. Not this Calvin. But Mr. Calvin here, he was the scientist that discovered the cycle, and you'll read about him in your power thinking. The light reactions, these, again, convert solar energy to chemical energy. So we got ATP out of it. We got NADPH out of it. So what can we do now? Well, something very important, which is build stuff. And the things that we can build are all the organic molecules. So this is photo, our first set of reactions. Now our second set is going to be synthesis, where we're going to make sugar. Not we, but plants. So how is that helpful? Well, we want to make glucose. C6H12O6 is glucose. And to do this, we need to think about what we have available. We have carbon dioxide. And if you see here, we've got carbon and oxygen in our glucose formula, and hydrogen, well, we got that from water. So we're going to be able to see what happens. So carbon dioxide to sugar. This is called carbon fixation. So taking carbon that's in the environment, that's in the atmosphere, and putting it into a usable form like glucose, carbon fixation. It's going to use NADPH, which is going to help reduce or build up. I know that sounds contradictory. We're not going to get into the chemistry behind it, but it's going to help build glucose. Okay. So from carbon dioxide to glucose, carbon dioxide has very little chemical energy. You can't do much with it. But glucose contains a lot. So we want to make glucose so that we can use it for when we need it. It's an endergonic process. So we're going to need to put in plants are going to need to put in a lot of energy to make it happen. And it proceeds in very small uphill steps that are each catalyzed by a specific enzyme. And then they also use energy stored in ATP and NADPH to do this. Okay. So the Calvin cycle happens in the chloroplast stroma, so that fluid-filled space of the chloroplast. You can see there. It needs the products of the light reaction in order to drive the synthesis reaction. So the ATP and the NADPH we see here that was made in the light reactions are now going to be used in the Calvin cycle. Okay. So this is going to go through the basics of it. You won't even need to know it in this much detail, but it helps you understand it. Okay, so to begin with, within the stroma of the chloroplast is this ribulose bisphosphate, these 5 5-carbon sugars. Okay, and the enzyme called ribisco, ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase, is going to be responsible for fixating carbon, the first step of the Calvin cycle. So we've got 3 molecules of CO2. And from these, adding these 3 here to our carbon molecules over here, we end up with 3 6-carbon sugars on this side. This is carbon fixation. This is a very unstable molecule. So quickly, it breaks down into 6 3-carbon sugars. And then using ATP, they rearrange themselves slightly. And then using NADPH, they go from having bonds like this, double bonds, to being saturated with hydrogen. So the hydrogens that came off of NADPH are going to attach to our carbon molecules here. So we have 6 of them. Okay, and this is called glyceraldehyde 3P, okay, or G3P. And this is really what's produced, and because this is the next molecule that's used to make glucose. So we simplify it by just saying that it makes glucose, but it really makes G3P. And then this can go on to make starch, sucrose, cellulose, and other structures as well. And so we take 3 ATP to get it back to our RUBP, or ribulose bisphosphate, so the cycle can begin again. Okay. What you need to know is that carbon dioxide comes in and it uses ATP and NADPH to make glucose. G3P is important because it can be made to produce glucose and therefore carbohydrates. It can also be made to produce lipids, and then it can also be made to produce amino acids and proteins and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. So it's an intermediate molecule. It's very, very important. Ribisco is the enzyme that fixes carbon from the air. It's probably the most important enzyme in the world because without it, we wouldn't have any sugar from photosynthesis. We wouldn't have life. So it's definitely the most abundant enzyme. And we got Kerman over here saying it's not easy being green. So if you do the math, it's pretty complicated. 3 turns of the Calvin cycle makes 1 glucose or 1 G3P. And then 6 turns of the Calvin cycle gives us 1 glucose. So we need 6 carbon dioxides, 18 ATPs, 12 NADPHs in order to make glucose. So then any leftover ATP can be used elsewhere by the cell. I'm going to stop here, and we're going to start off with this in class next time. So please record any questions you have, and we will certainly finish and go over this some more in class. See you then.